So, what if the big global conflicts of the early 2000s weren't about what we were told they were about? Today, we're going to dive into a pretty provocative blog series from 2006 that lays out a completely different story, one about a hidden war against faith itself. We're going to break down this author's very specific and, yeah, pretty controversial take on the world. Okay, so the author's entire argument really kicks off from this one big idea. They claim that the core conflict of the time wasn't about oil, it wasn't about land. Nope. It was about the West seeing what the author calls true Islam as a real threat to its global system, its entire way of life.
Right, but that leads to a huge question. I mean, how do you even fight a belief system? The author argues that a direct head-on war would be a disaster. It would just make Muslims' faith stronger, and, get this, it might even make Islam appealing to young, disillusioned people in the West. So, they needed a different playbook, something way more subtle.
All right, let's dig into the central thesis here. The author isn't just talking about a conflict. They're describing a meticulously planned secret war against an entire religion. And according to the text, this wasn't some defensive move. It was a preemptive strike. In their view, it was a full-on conspiracy by these great Western minds to actively break down and dismantle a faith that they saw as a direct challenge to their global power. So if they're not going to fight an open war, what do they do? Well, according to the author, the plan was something much, much sneakier. Make entire societies just collapse from the inside. A strategy of erosion built on four main pillars. And here they are, the 4 steps. The whole point, according to this worldview, was to create a trap. To keep Muslim populations so poor, so uneducated, and so busy fighting each other that they're just stuck in survival mode, never able to build anything new or powerful.
And to really hammer home that first point, poverty, the author brings up this incredible quote. The idea here is that poverty isn't just a sad side effect. It's the weapon. It's something so destructive it can turn a whole society into, and this is a quote from the text, ash that the winds scatter on a stormy day.
Okay, so you have this big theory, this grand plan, but where do you actually do it? Where's the testing ground? Well, for this author, the answer was crystal clear: Iraq. That was the laboratory where this whole strategy would be put to the test.
Now, this is where it gets really controversial. The author lays out this chain of events, and for them, 9/11 isn't the starting point. No, it's the excuse. It was the justification they needed to kick off a series of interventions, like setting up geopolitical dominoes just to watch them fall, one by one, with Iran being the final target in the region.
Forget liberation. The author says that was just talk. In this view, the real goal was pure, calculated chaos. The idea was to engineer a brutal civil war between Sunni and Shia Muslims, to get the country to tear itself apart and destroy its own religious foundations from the inside. And now we get to what the author sees as the absolute masterstroke of this whole thing. They call it the great idea, and it's kind of like a geopolitical judo move, using your opponent's own strength against them.
So what is this great idea? It's simple, and according to the author, absolutely brutal. Treat the disease with the disease itself. They supposedly looked at Islam and said, what's its most powerful concept? Jihad. And then they allegedly decided to corrupt it, to twist it into a weapon to be used against Islam itself.
So how would you do that? Well, according to this text, you create a monster. You supposedly fund and promote extremist groups like Al-Qaeda to basically become the public face of Islam. That way, the world sees this horrifying death cult, not what the author calls a faith of justice and civilization.
And this is where Iraq becomes so important again. In this view, turning it into a war zone served 2 huge purposes at once. First, it's like a bug zapper. It attracts angry militants from all over the world to one spot far from the West. And second, it keeps the nearby authoritarian regimes, the ones allied with the West, safe.
Okay, so right here, the whole tone of the writing just changes. It gets really dark. To show you how this twisted ideology is sold to people, the author writes this incredibly sarcastic, bitter monologue from the point of view of a recruiter. It's chilling stuff. The sales pitch starts with this mission: help God with his work. It's this cynical idea that you're not committing a sin, you're doing God a favor, speeding things along. A total perversion of faith.
And where are you going? Your destination is the Jannah Express. The author uses this phrase to mock the whole idea that you can just skip the line, that violence is some kind of express lane to heaven, a shortcut that lets you bypass a life of actual good deeds. But this is where the sarcasm gets absolutely brutal. Who are your targets? The poor, the helpless, especially women and children. And the twisted logic they're supposedly sold is that it's an act of mercy. You're saving them from a terrible life. It's just a horrifying and devastating picture of how this violent ideology is supposed to work.
So after all of that, this grand, cynical theory about global politics, where does that leave a person? Well, in the last part of the blog series, the author's focus completely shifts. It goes from geopolitics to just raw, personal despair. And it all starts with this one simple question: why am I alive? Suddenly, it's not about nations and strategies anymore. It's about trying to find any meaning in a world that, from their perspective, is just filled with manufactured suffering.
And they get into this really deep, heavy conversation with a friend. They're wrestling with this massive idea. If you're born into a terrible situation that pretty much forces you to sin, did you really have a choice? Is free will even real? Or is your entire life just mapped out for you from day one?
And that feeling of helplessness, of cosmic unfairness, is all wrapped up in this one quote from the text, which is like a direct plea to God. It's the voice of someone who just feels completely trapped by their circumstances, looking up and asking, why me? What did I do to deserve this?
So, after all that analysis, all that philosophical pain, where does the author land? What's their final conclusion from back in 2006? Well, they point the finger at one place. They identify America, which they say is driven by Zionist planning, as the modern origin of evil in the world, citing a spiritual emptiness and blind tyrannical power. And in the end, that 2006 text doesn't really give us a final answer. Instead, it leaves us hanging with this huge, unsettling question. If everything is just a result of circumstance, if we're all just products of the situation we're born into, then what does justice even mean, in this life or the next? And that question about fate and fairness is really the unresolved heart of this whole very provocative worldview we've just walked through.